Okay, so as I said, the topic today that I want to tell you about, supplementary topic, is on complexity and emergence. First of all, we'll get into why do we care about complexity. It's actually a word that everyone has heard a lot, quite frequently. Stephen Hawking, the noted physicist who unfortunately passed away, I guess it's been 2 or 3 years now, before he died, he said that, I think that the next century will be the century of complexity. He said that we've already discovered a lot of basic laws that govern matter in normal situations. However, fitting the laws together and seeing what happens under extreme conditions is sort of what the frontier of science will be in his mind, or as he said, in the 21st century. So what exactly is it that he was talking about whenever he was mentioning complexity? Well, you've all heard the world is getting more complex. But what precisely does that mean? First of all, we'll talk about that, and then what are the implications of the world becoming increasingly complex? As a thought exercise, before I go into the kind of defining what the attributes are of complexity, that'll be part of our goal today is, if someone says, such and such a system, I'm designing a system, but it's very complex. If someone were to ask, well, what exactly do you mean? You should be able to answer that after this lecture. Reason I think that's important maybe is because there is sort of a common, colloquial use of the term. However, I think that just as in the systems community, we can get better about being more precise about the definition, really so that we can distinguish, is a system just complicated, for instance, or is it actually complex? So as a thought exercise, though, what is the difference about these two system failures? One was the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. You probably heard about that one a lot. This happened in 1940. They were actually doing a test, like a vibration test at the time, so they were able to get pictures of it, surprisingly. This is in Washington. How does that compare? How would that compare to the global financial crisis of 2008? And this is someone in front of the Lehman building. As you remember, the Lehman Brothers collapsed at the time. So what would you say, just sort of, offhand, if you think about it, what would be the difference between those two? One that I can think of would be, in the Tacoma Narrows Bridge example, it was designed presumably using quote unquote traditional systems engineering approaches, or I guess in that I should just say engineering approaches, although civil engineering does, I think, naturally use a lot of systems concepts because they do tend to design for the entire life cycle. But one distinguishing characteristic of this failure is that in some sense it was predictable at the beginning, and it was relatively simple. And by simple I mean that it does have some moving parts, some parts that can constrict and flex and things like that. But you can use traditional engineering principles to do a design on paper, go out and do a test, and at that point, even though it's composed, it is a system in that it's composed of many components. There isn't a lot of interdependencies or connections between those components, in contrast to the global financial crisis. And you might think, well, what are some of the underlying reasons why this happened? Well, you might think, okay, well, there are a lot of connections and interdependencies in this global financial system. Maybe there were silos, maybe there was bureaucracy, maybe there was human psychology coming into play. Human psychology isn't something that came into play whenever you're dealing with the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Maybe in the design process, but once it was built, you don't have these sorts of effects. So given that as sort of an introduction, complexity science, it's been explored, especially heavily over the past couple of decades. You've probably heard of related scientific methods like chaos theory was something that was big in the 80s and 90s. Complexity science is actually more encompassing than chaos. We'll talk about chaos. But here are some of the problems that fall under the scope of complexity science. Collapse of economic systems, like in the global financial collapse I just mentioned. Biological ecosystems. Spread of pandemics. I actually wrote these notes before anything with COVID-19 happened, but complexity science, if you look at the various algorithms that are used to model pandemics, that's done using complexity science, various methods of complexity science. Traffic jams. Things like power outages on the grid. We'll talk about how they're complex systems. Growth and behavior of social networks themselves, which obviously social networks is becoming increasingly complex. I shouldn't say complex, but increasingly used in making, let's say, businesses more complex. I'll define what that means in a moment. And system robustness and resilience. These are relatively new topics. You have robustness in terms of feedback control. That's not a really new concept. It's been developed and used for the past couple of decades. But whenever it comes to systems like the power grid, thinking about robustness and resilience of the power grid are relatively new.